Now let's go to still on the US Africa Summit. We have seen, they said 49 countries have been invited out of 55 member states. And four of them are because they are banned by the African Union because of the coup that's happening. Whether the coup is right or not, that's something debatable. It's for the African people to say, but the African Union has banned those countries, namely Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Sudan. And the other two are Eritrea and Western Sahara. Also, they are regular members like the rest of the 49 member states in the African Union, but they have not been invited by the US because they haven't, from as per my readings, they haven't exchanged diplomatic mission with the US. Now, my question is there anything that actually these member states would lose by not participating or not taking part in this summit? And what would have been actually the African Union stand, at least for those two countries, which are regular members of the Union, which are not banned, Eritrea and Western Sahara? Is there anything that they would lose by not taking part? And then what would have been the AU stance?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mahlet, for actually mentioning all those countries which have not been invited. We all know definitely the reason why countries like Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso have not been invited to this summit because Mali, these three countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea, have taken a strong stand, together with Eritrea. They have taken a very strong stand against, imperialism and interference. They have decided to take back power, for the interest of the African people. In the past, starting in the 1960s, the African leaders who have maintained their position that they are here to represent the interests of the African people. We know that they have been in some way poisoned, in another way. They have been toppled from power when the poisoning has failed, or they have outright killed them. Like for the case of Lumumba, we know poisoning, like what happened to Magufuli. So these leaders who have stood in this position, it has been rough for them. It has been a difficult, they have faced difficult times. But to go on to examine whether this summit is going to be any beneficial, to the attending, countries, and less beneficial in any way to the Africans or the African countries that are not going, the 4 or 5 African countries that are not going to attend. I think is necessary to go back, like we said, in history, to understand ever since the US Africa Summit started, what has it really benefited the Africans? It's just a few jobs here and there, but majority of the benefit has gone to the United States. Like if you go to Ethiopia, for example, I remember Ethiopia was dropped from AGOA. These industries have come here to exploit cheap labor. So when they are here in Ethiopia or in Africa, they're here to exploit cheap labor, exploit raw materials in this sense, and they make the biggest profit. And in most cases, for us, it is a compromise. In most cases, it is a compromise. You go to economies like Ghana, which they maybe say is the one. These are the ones which will benefit more because they have been saying that this is the beacon of democracy on the African continent. You see that it has now one of the highest inflation on the African continent. So what happened? Because to a certain extent, the country opened itself up without controls to these foreign companies, and they took over the economy. So whenever they pull out, whenever these countries, like I said, they are facing economic trouble in the West, they pull out money from our countries to take care of their business. And then we suffer the most here. And so for countries like Ghana, which solely depend, and they have handed over their economic sovereignty to these, imperialistic countries, then they are bound to suffer. So they suffer actually to a certain level, even more than the other ones which have sanctions on them, like Zimbabwe, because Zimbabwe now, even though it has had sanctions for the last 20 years, but it's a country which has learned to be self-sufficient. So to a larger extent, you see that these countries which have not, been invited, they build up, normally they build up resilience. You can see that Ethiopia, after the sanctions and what and all those things which are coming, it has been able to grow wheat and even start, people are talking about it has more than enough. It's going even to export wheat. So this is the resilience that is built up. And our economists, like Dambisa Moyo in the past, have advocated for self-sufficiency on the continent. It's just that there is some African leaders who don't listen to our economists, but they have advocated for self-sufficiency, and we have to stop the aid. We have to stand as a people with dignity, with a lot of dignity, and start building ourselves up using the resources we have without squandering those resources. So if you ask me whether they are going to miss much, I really don't see what they are going to miss. One, these countries, like we said, they are in a whole lot of big trouble. They don't have money. They don't have money. The United States debt has skyrocketed according to data which came up the end of last year. The debt in the United States has skyrocketed to $30 trillion. So they don't have money. They are printing a lot of useless, money, and that is what they are telling us. That they are giving us aid. They are not giving us any aid. When you go back to the Paris Climate Agreement, when it was signed, they pledged together with the whole Western world that they will help Africa to mitigate the consequences, the effects of the climate change, which they have caused. They pledged $100 billion. Not even half of that money has been dispensed. Remember the Paris Climate Change, agreement. I think it was signed in 2015 or somewhere there. I think it should be 2015 during the Obama era. So I don't remember very well there, but they have never, come up to meet their pledges. They have never fulfilled their pledges of $100 billion, which they said they would dispense that money onto Africa for Africa to be able to fight against climate change, or even to install clean energy systems on the continent. They have never met, they have never stood up and to meet their pledges. So, and this is what I'm saying, is that they don't have money. So when we go to Washington for this summit, what is going to happen there, I suspect, is that it's just coercion that is going to happen. Coercion is what is going to happen there. But also, the other thing is that they have run out of options. They have run out of options. What you are going to see in these summits is that is just to it is called face saving. They are trying to save their faces, to show you have had them mentioning win-win or mutual respect. But these things which they are saying, these slogans that they are throwing around, win-win, mutual respect for Africans, it is China. They are trying to copy China, what China has been doing on the continent. Because China in the past is the one who started to come to the African continent and say, we are not going to interfere in your affairs. We are not going to interfere in your political affairs and your economic affairs and how you run your economies. We are here for this. Because China comes to the continent strictly for business and tells you what they want, and then you tell them what you want. And then you agree. If you agree, you take the deal. If you don't agree, you leave the deal. So China came up with that, strategy and policy of mutual respect. So they are trying to copy that. And China came up with the Belt and Road Initiative. And, we have seen ports built, we have seen railway lines built from Djibouti to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. We have seen ports built in, in Mombasa. We have seen a railway line built, from Mombasa, to Nairobi. We have seen a lot of infrastructure even up to, Nigeria. We have seen a lot of infrastructure during this, even in Europe itself. So the United States and its European allies also came up with some sort of global infrastructure program. They say that they will dispense money, $600 billion, here $600 billion, but that money is nowhere. They don't have the money. So all this is just talk, is empty talk and face saving to show that they are doing something. But when in actuality, they are not doing anything. The United States and the West, first of all, is not interested in improving anybody's well-being and economies and welfare apart from themselves. We have seen that these people have been here for the last 600 years. Okay, ever since they had contact with the African continent. What have they contributed to the African continent? They have not contributed anything. Instead, they have sucked out resources. We remember that in 2020, the United Nations came up with a report about the illicit financial outflows out of the African continent. And from that report, it was published that the money that is flowing out of Africa is around $100 billion every year. And when they traced where this money is going, even though these people say that they are giving us aid on the African continent, but when it was traced, the money flowing out of Africa, it was traced that the money is going to Washington, the money is going to London, the money is going to, to Paris. So even though they give what they call aid, which is around $30 billion, that is what they say that they give, the money that is flowing out of the African continent is much more than that. So they are here to exploit the African continent. And actually that figure, the conservative Pan-Africanists have estimated that figure to be much higher than $100 billion. It is around $200 billion. And when you look at $200 billion flowing out of the African continent, is the same money which is required for Africa to meet its infrastructure needs. Africa faces an annual infrastructure deficit of $200 billion a year. So you can see that these people are robbing us of infrastructure. They are robbing us of aeroplanes, airports, high-speed trains and rails on the African continent. They are robbing us of hospitals. They are robbing us of schools and good healthy facilities, conducive, environment and roads. They are robbing us of all this Western world. But at the same time, they are saying that they are giving us. So they are not interested in improving anybody's lives. And they have been living above their means. That is the other thing. So do not expect, that is where I stand and say that do not expect anything, to come out of the US Africa Summit that is going to be held this month, whereby the African heads of state are going to attend. There is really nothing constructive that is going to, to come out of this. And I think that the African heads of state have to understand this. The African Union, the chairperson of the African Union Commission and the chairperson of the African Union, they have to come together to mobilize the African heads of state to understand that we have to start standing on our feet, that these people have been parasites who have been exploiting the continent, and also to emphasize what we achieved in South Africa recently, that African solutions to African problems has to be our narrative. And not only politically, security-wise on the continent, but also economically. We have to start moving rapidly in that direction, that our economic activities, our military, and security, all of them, we have to be able to take care, of those aspects.
Thank you very much, Kwame. Indeed, for that. It's really important. I just want to add, for our audiences, those 4 countries which amongst the 6 which are not invited 4 of them are because of Western Africa. They resisted 3 of them: Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, and they stood against, the continued colonialism of France, and they brought, they set up their own government, whether it's a coup or not. Every coup is bad, by the way. Let's
Yes.
establish that fact.
Yes.
Not every coup is bad. So some coups are really needed and brought by the people, and there's nothing more important than the need.
Actually, in countries like Mali, it was not actually a coup. It's the people who are discontented with the president. So when the people were angry about the insecurity on the continent, because this president was working with France and destabilizing the place much more, than required, and people are dying. France actually killed more than 4,000 people in Mali. France and the French military, together with the Germans, together. We have heard recently that even Britain was there. So it is ironic that we have military bases on the African continent. We have militaries involved on the continent, and African heads of state and the African Union, they don't know that these people are here. So it is recently that we had that German and Britain were also in Mali. Their troops were in Mali. And it is, it is unforgivable. It is pathetic. It is absurd that African heads of state continue to allow these kind of affairs, and continue to tow the neo-colonial, line. And what we are saying to the African heads of state and the African Union is that the African Union has to stop parroting the neo-colonial narrative, and it has to start, parroting the African narrative. Because when it starts imposing sanctions on Mali, when we know from our analysis as Pan-Africans that the Malian people were tired of France, and then you come as African Union and ECOWAS and put sanctions on Mali, for us it is it is very disgusting to us as Africans. It is unfortunate and disgusting to us as Africans, and it makes the African Union and ECOWAS look like neo-colonial puppets and neo-colonial tools, which is unfortunate that we don't want to look at these organizations in such a way. So the people in Mali stood up, and when they stood up and they were tired of this insecurity and the incompetence of the president who was supported, by France, then it is the military who responded, to what the people wanted, and said, Mr. President, you have to go, because this is what the people are saying. They are tired of you. So it was not actually a coup. It was a takeover by the people themselves. And when the African Union fails to analyze this, to make an analysis, a correct analysis of the conditions on the ground, I think this becomes very unfortunate. I think the African Union needs Pan-Africans to be able to advise it. And the people are here. We are here to advise them on what is going on the continent, instead of them just coming out with blanket statements which are neo-colonial and not beneficial to the continent, and making them and putting sanctions and coming up with policies which are colonial in nature. And this is what we abhor, this is what we reject as African people.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for elaborating on that. And also it shows, the double standard of the African Union. That's why I asked specifically what should have been the African Union stance, because let's call it a coup, as they say. Also, this happened in Chad, by the way, which is enforced upon the people, the son of Idris, what was their president anyway? Maybe I'm making a mistake, but the son took over the power, and that was not, what the people wanted. But Chad continued its membership in the African Union, and let's not forget that our current chairperson of the African Union is from Chad. So, there's no coincidence. That's a double standard by the African Union. And
absolutely. And that is why I say that the African Union, if it doesn't have people who do analysis for it, I think it is high time that it reaches out to us so that we can do analysis for them and give them advice on what to do, instead of making spontaneous, statements that are not based on research and are not based on what is on the ground, and not based on what the African civil society is saying. We are the African civil society, because we understand, we are on the ground, and we understand, what is going on the ground, and they are up there in offices in air conditions. They don't know what is going on the ground with the people. So instead of coming out and making blanket statements and I mean, and this is not to disrespect the African Union for the work it does. Definitely, it has done some good work. It has done some good work, like we said recently, in South Africa, in settling the rebellion that was in the northern part of Ethiopia. But I think that it needs to do more. It needs to be African. It needs to toe the African line. It needs to toe the Nkrumahist line. Would Nkrumah impose sanctions on Mali? No, he would not. Would Nkrumah be selective in his application of sanctions and apply sanctions on Mali and Guinea and not apply sanctions on Chad? Of course not. So, it has to be African in its nature. And people who are acting on behalf of foreign forces in the African Union, I think that people have to be uprooted out and removed from the African Union.
Definitely. That's really important. Yes, we don't give up on the African Union. It's founded by our ancestors, our forefathers, who have that Pan-African vision. But is this something that they would have imagined after 60 years or 65 years where this organization would be? Well, that's something to discuss. But it's for the people, it's for the citizens, for the African citizens. So we don't give up that on that organization. Instead, what we are saying is it should serve its citizen to the missions that it has originally established for. But also just on Eritrea also, I think it's a cover to say, oh, they don't have diplomatic mission with the US. But the real reason, let's call a spade is a spade. Eritrea is the only country in the continent that refused to have AFRICOM in its land, in its territory. So that country suffers a lot because it resisted a lot of bullying and continued neocolonialism in the continent.